I never imagined the man I trusted the most, my husband's father, could make me feel this way. It started with stolen glances and quiet conversations, but the night we were caught together, everything shattered. My husband stood in the doorway, rain pouring behind him, his eyes burning with betrayal. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I was 27 years old, living what seemed like a peaceful life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My husband, David, was a hard-working contractor who often left home before sunrise and returned well after dark. We had been married for 6 years, and though our relationship had settled into a comfortable routine, there were cracks I tried hard to ignore. David was dependable, a provider, but emotionally, he felt distant. He had always been more focused on his work than our marriage, and as time passed, the emotional void between us grew. I often found myself lonely, spending evenings cooking dinner, cleaning the house, and scrolling through my phone, hoping for a distraction. When David's father, Richard, moved in with us after his health began to decline, I saw it as just another responsibility added to my list. He was 63, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that still carried traces of the vibrant man he once was. At first, I kept my distance, treating him like a guest I was obligated to care for. But Richard had a way of making me feel seen, something David hadn't done in years. He noticed the little things, how I rearranged the living room, the meals I carefully prepared, and the way I always made sure the house felt warm and welcoming. "You have a gift, Emily," he said one evening, his voice soft yet firm. "You bring life into this home." Those words lingered with me. It had been so long since anyone had appreciated me, let alone complimented me. Over time, I found myself lingering at the dinner table after meals, listening to Richard's stories about his younger days. He spoke about love, loss, and the sacrifices he made for his family. The more we talked, the more I felt drawn to him, not as a father-in-law, but as a man who understood me. I hated myself for the thoughts that crept into my mind, but I couldn't stop them. It was as if he saw me in a way David never had. I didn't know it then, but those quiet moments were planting seeds that would soon grow into something dangerous, something neither of us could contain. It started subtly, so subtly that I convinced myself it was harmless. Richard's compliments lingered in my mind longer than they should have. The way his eyes followed me as I moved around the house sent a shiver down my spine, and yet I never looked away. David was still oblivious. He came home exhausted, barely noticing the shift in energy between his father and me. I told myself it was just admiration, an innocent bond formed out of shared loneliness. But deep down I knew better. The moments we spent together grew longer. Richard began helping me with chores, his hands brushing against mine when we passed dishes back and forth. I told myself it was accidental, but each touch left my skin burning. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Richard's hand lingered on mine a moment too long. I froze, feeling the tension between us thickening. He quickly pulled away, muttering an apology, but the damage had already been done. I couldn't sleep that night. My heart raced as I replayed every interaction, every word, and every look we had shared. Guilt weighed on me, but it wasn't strong enough to drown out the thrill I felt whenever he was near. I began to notice David watching us. His eyes lingered a little longer when Richard and I spoke, and his questions became sharper. "What were you two laughing about?" he asked one night, his voice casual but his eyes serious. "Just a story he told me about his younger days," I replied, forcing a smile. David didn't say anything else, but I saw the way he studied my face as if searching for cracks in my answer. Then the excuses began. Richard started finding reasons to stay up late, offering to help me with tasks that didn't really require his assistance. And I let him. One night, after David had gone to bed, Richard and I found ourselves sitting on the porch. The moonlight cast a glow over his face, and for the first time, I felt myself drawn to him without guilt, just longing. "You don't deserve to feel alone like this," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Tears welled up in my eyes. "I don't know how it got this bad," I admitted, my voice trembling. He reached for my hand, and I let him. Neither of us spoke, but in that silence everything changed. The following days were a blur of stolen glances and whispered words. The guilt gnawed at me, but the desire only grew stronger. I began avoiding David, afraid that he would see the truth in my eyes. One evening, David came home earlier than expected. I was sitting too close to Richard on the couch, our knees brushing. David's eyes darted between us, and I saw the flicker of suspicion before he turned away. "What's going on here?" he asked later that night, his voice tight. "Nothing," I lied, but I could feel the foundation of my life crumbling beneath me. The tension in the house became unbearable. David grew quieter, but his stares became sharper, more accusing. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from being near Richard. I told myself I would end it, that it had to stop. But every time I tried, I found myself pulled back in, as if something bigger than me had already taken over. The boundaries between us blurred faster than I could rebuild them. What started as lingering glances turned into shared touches that lasted too long, hushed conversations that carried too much weight, and moments of silence where we said everything without speaking a word. One night, after David had gone to bed, I found myself alone with Richard again. The dim glow of the living room lamp softened the tension, but it couldn't hide the longing in his eyes, or mine. "You should go to bed," I whispered, my voice trembling as I avoided his gaze. "Emily." His voice was low, steady, but filled with an ache I had felt for weeks. "Do you really want me to?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I turned away, but he stepped closer. I felt his breath on my neck, and every nerve in my body ignited. When his hand brushed my arm, I should have pulled away. Instead, I leaned into it. "It's wrong," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "So why does it feel like the only thing that's right?" he replied. His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. My heart pounded as his fingers traced down my arm, leaving a trail of heat that refused to fade. "Stop," I said, but I didn't move. He gently turned me to face him, his eyes searching mine for hesitation, for doubt. But there was none. And before I could think, his lips were on mine. The world around us disappeared. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, all of it melted away in that moment. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something forbidden and irresistible. When we finally broke apart, reality came crashing down. I pulled away, my breathing ragged, and stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "We can't do this," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, stepping back. "But it doesn't change how I feel." I couldn't sleep that night. The weight of what we had done pressed against my chest, but it wasn't enough to stop me from wanting him again. Over the next few days, we tried to act normal, but the tension only grew. The way his hand lingered when he passed me something, the looks we exchanged when no one was watching. It was all too much. David sensed it. I could see it in the way he watched us, his eyes shadowed with suspicion and doubt. "Is everything okay with my dad?" he asked one night as we lay in bed. "Of course," I lied, turning away to hide the guilt on my face. But David wasn't convinced. He started coming home earlier, checking in more often, and his eyes lingered on me longer than before. Despite the risk, Richard and I couldn't stop. The secrecy made it more intoxicating, more irresistible. One rainy afternoon, when David was supposed to be at work, Richard found me in the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. "You should leave before David gets home," I said, but my voice lacked the firmness it should have had. "Not yet," he said softly, stepping closer. I couldn't resist him. The pull was too strong, the desire too overwhelming. When his lips met mine again, it was like giving in to a force I had no control over. But then the door slammed. I froze, my heart dropping into my stomach. David's footsteps echoed down the hall, and before I could move, he was standing there, soaking wet and staring at us. His eyes darted between us, and in that instant, I saw the betrayal register on his face. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and trembling. I couldn't speak. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. "Dad!" David's voice cracked, and Richard stepped back, guilt written all over his face. "It's not what it looks like," Richard said, but even he didn't sound convinced. David's fists clenched, and I braced myself for the storm I knew was coming. "Get out," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of you." The silence that followed was suffocating. I wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the look in David's eyes told me it was already too late. Richard turned to leave, but before he stepped out, he looked back at me one last time. It wasn't regret I saw in his eyes, it was longing. And that terrified me more than anything else. The door slammed behind Richard, leaving me alone with David and the unbearable weight of what had just happened. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as his eyes locked onto mine. "Explain," he demanded, his voice trembling with restrained anger. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My thoughts raced, scrambling for excuses, explanations, anything that might soften the blow. But there was nothing I could say to undo what he had just seen. "Was it just a mistake?" he asked, stepping closer. "Tell me it was nothing." I wanted to lie, to say it meant nothing, but the truth burned inside me. Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. I didn't mean for it to happen, I whispered. It just did. David's expression hardened. It just did. With my father? His voice cracked, the betrayal cutting deeper than either of us could bear. I took a step toward him, but he flinched, pulling back as if my touch would burn him. Don't, he said. Don't try to make this okay. Tears streamed down my face as I begged, please, David. I know what I did was wrong, but I never stopped loving you. His eyes flashed with pain. Don't lie to me, Emily. You don't do this to someone you love. The silence between us grew heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. I watched as David's shoulders sank, the anger giving way to heartbreak. Did you sleep with him? He finally asked, his voice hollow. I froze. No, I said quickly, but the hesitation was enough. David let out a bitter laugh, his hands raking through his hair. I can't even look at you right now. He turned away, and for the first time, I realized how much damage I had done, not just to my marriage but to the man who had given me everything. In the days that followed, the house became unbearable. David stopped speaking to me, his presence a constant reminder of my betrayal. Richard was gone, but his absence felt like a ghost haunting every corner of the home. I tried to mend things, cooking David's favorite meals, leaving notes apologizing, and even suggesting therapy. But he barely acknowledged me. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard him crying in the next room. It was the first time I had ever seen him break, and it shattered me. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him I still loved him, but I knew my words wouldn't be enough. Days turned into weeks, and David finally confronted me. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice steady but broken. I can't stay in this house and pretend everything's fine. Are you leaving me? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, he admitted. But I need space. That night, he packed a bag and left. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the door and hoping he'd come back. But he didn't. As the days passed, the weight of my actions grew heavier. I replayed every moment with Richard, questioning how I let it go so far. Was it loneliness? Desire? Or something deeper that I had never admitted to myself? Then came the letter. It was from Richard, short, apologetic, but filled with emotions he hadn't been able to express. I'm sorry for what we did, he wrote. But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. I hope you can forgive me one day. I burned the letter. It didn't make the guilt go away, but it felt like the first step toward letting him go. David eventually came back, but things were never the same. He moved into the guest room, and our conversations became mechanical, discussing bills, schedules, and the bare necessities of life. I wanted to fix us, but David wouldn't let me in. One evening, as we sat in silence over dinner, he finally looked up at me. Do you still love him? He asked. No, I said firmly. I love you. He nodded but didn't say anything else. And I knew in that moment that love alone wouldn't be enough to save us. Our marriage hung in limbo, neither ending nor healing. And every time I looked at David, I saw the scars I had left behind. But the worst part wasn't losing him. It was knowing that a part of me still wondered what might have been if things had been different. The days after David's return felt like walking through a minefield. He was physically present, but emotionally absent. The air between us was thick with words left unsaid, and every glance felt like a dagger to my heart. I tried to rebuild what we had, but the damage was too deep. David avoided my touch, and even the simplest conversations were strained. The man who once laughed with me, shared dreams with me, now looked at me like a stranger. I threw myself into distractions, cleaning, organizing, taking care of our daughter, but no amount of effort could erase the emptiness inside me. Nights were the worst. David slept in the guest room, and I lay awake, haunted by memories of Richard's voice, his touch, and the storm of emotions that had brought us to this point. David began staying out late, coming home long after our daughter was asleep. I knew he wasn't cheating, he wasn't the type, but I also knew he was searching for an escape, just like I had. One night, I finally confronted him. Are you ever going to forgive me? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me. I don't know if I can. Tears filled my eyes. David, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I love you. I need you. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw the pain that still lingered. You didn't need me when you turned to him. His words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't argue. He was right. The weeks dragged on, and the distance between us only grew. David became more withdrawn, and I felt myself falling apart. I spent hours replaying everything, wondering if there was any way to fix what I had broken. And then came the day he packed his bags. I can't do this anymore, Emily, he said, his voice flat. Don't leave, I begged. Please, we can fix this. But he shook his head. I've tried and I just can't. I can't trust you. And without trust, what's left? He left that night, and the sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. For weeks I spiraled. I cried until I couldn't breathe, drank too much wine to numb the pain, and ignored calls from friends and family. The house felt hollow, and everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of what I had lost. But the worst part was explaining it to our daughter. "Where's Daddy?" she asked one morning, her big eyes filled with confusion. He's staying somewhere else for a while," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Did I do something wrong? Her words shattered me. I pulled her into my arms, fighting back tears. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. Mommy and Daddy just need some time apart." But even as I said it, I knew it was more than that. I tried to rebuild my life, but the shame never fully left me. Gossip spread quickly, and I could feel the judgment in every glance at the grocery store, every hushed conversation that stopped when I walked by. I avoided Richard completely, though part of me wondered where he had gone and if he felt the same guilt I did. I hated him for what we had done, but I hated myself more for letting it happen. Over time, the pain dulled, but it never disappeared. I focused on being a mother, pouring everything I had into my daughter to make up for the family I had destroyed. I saw David occasionally at school events or drop-offs, but we barely spoke. He seemed to be doing better, and that hurt more than I expected. There were moments when I wanted to beg him to come back, to tell him I had changed, but I knew it was too late. The trust we had was gone, and no amount of love could bring it back. Richard's memory lingered like a ghost. I hated him, missed him, and resented the part of me that still felt drawn to him. But I knew I would never see him again, and maybe that was for the best. The days turned into months, and life moved forward even when I felt stuck in the past. The echoes of what I had done lingered, but I learned to live with them. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a shell, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. David officially filed for divorce. The papers arrived quietly, without dramatic confrontations or angry words. It was a clean break on the surface, but inside, it left wounds that refused to heal. I signed them, knowing it was the only way to set him free from the pain I had caused. I threw myself into being the best mother I could be. My daughter became my lifeline, the one thing that kept me grounded when everything else had fallen apart. Her innocence reminded me that I still had something worth fighting for, even if the rest of my world had crumbled. But even as I focused on her, there were nights when the guilt came back in waves. I would lie awake, replaying every decision, every moment that led to my betrayal. Was it loneliness? Weakness? Or had I simply been looking for something I thought I'd lost? I never heard from Richard again. He left without a trace, and a part of me wondered if he was trying to bury the past just as I was. I hated him for leaving me to pick up the pieces, but deep down, I knew he had no choice. Over time, I stopped blaming him. What happened between us wasn't just his fault or mine, it was both of ours. We let our emotions control us, and we paid the price. I learned to forgive myself, though it didn't come easily. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting my mistakes and vowing never to repeat them. I also came to understand the fragility of trust. It's something that takes years to build but only a moment to destroy. I had taken David's love for granted, and in the end, I lost him because of it. But perhaps the biggest lesson I learned was that love isn't always enough. No matter how deeply you care for someone, relationships need more than passion to survive. They need honesty, communication, and trust. Without those things, even the strongest bonds can break. Years later, I still think about that time in my life. Not as a source of shame, but as a chapter that shaped me. I'm stronger now, wiser. I've learned that temptation doesn't define us, but how we face the consequences does. I may never fully heal from what I did, but I've made peace with the scars it left behind. They remind me of the price I paid, and the lessons I carry with me. If there's one thing I hope others can take from my story, it's this: no moment of weakness is worth losing the people who truly love you. If you found this story emotional, thought-provoking, or relatable, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Emily's place? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking and unforgettable stories that dive deep into the complexities of love, betrayal, and forgiveness. Stay tuned. Our next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about relationships.